Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you could please find your way to your seats, we'll be beginning shortly. Good evening again. My name is Matt Abbott, and I'm the Director of Government and Diplomatic Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. On behalf of the Council, I would like to thank you for joining us this evening with Minister Han Sung-ju, our second Marshall M. Bouton Asia Fellow. I'd like to welcome both Minister Han and Marshall Bouton to Chicago, and we would like to thank the members of our board in attendance tonight whose generous support made this fellowship possible. Please note that our program this evening is on the record and we are live streaming. We welcome your engagement on social media, but please make sure to silence your phones. After Minister Han's remarks, we will take questions from the audience, and those of you joining us via live stream are welcome to submit questions by typing chi.cnf.io into your web browser. For nearly a century, the Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different perspectives to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Our introducer this evening will be Dr. Marshall Bouton. Dr. Bouton is Senior Fellow for India with the Asia Society Policy Institute. He is also President Emeritus of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, having served as President from 2001 to 2013. I will return later to moderate audience Q&A, and I would also like to invite you to join us for a networking reception immediately following the program. But now, please join me in welcoming Marshall Bouton.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is an absolute delight to be back in Chicago and to see many friends in this audience. I always love to come back to this city, and this is no exception. I want to thank Ivo Dalder and the Chicago Council first for hosting, presenting the Marshall M. Bouton Fellows so thoughtfully and so effectively. It's been a great personal honor and pleasure for me to see this happen. I also want to thank Jennifer Jun, who is the Council staff person who has masterminded these events so well now in the first 2 years of the program. And you all know by now, anybody who's in this room knows what a fantastic staff the Chicago Council has, and Jennifer's no exception. So clearly, the decision to invite former South Korean Foreign Minister Han Sung-ju to be the 2017 Bouton Asia Fellow was prescient, given what we know today about the urgency and tension around developments on the Korean Peninsula. Ivo and I made that decision over a year ago, actually. Now, in full disclosure, I want to share with all of you that Han Sung-ju and I have been friends for 30 years, a privilege I have enjoyed for all that time. So my view was biased from the very beginning, but I'm delighted that he accepted and that he is here with us today. You all know that North Korea's accelerated pace of testing missiles and its continued testing of nuclear weapons, and its stated intention of being able to strike the United States with nuclear weapons has led to a very heated state of affairs between North Korea and the United States, and to equally heated rhetoric on both sides. South Koreans and Japanese have watched this situation unfold themselves with great concern, and rightly so. For no nation has more at stake in the current crisis than the Republic of Korea. But remarkably, in our media and elsewhere, Americans have had few opportunities to hear from the perspectives of South Korean leaders on these issues, especially South Korean leaders who have had experience in dealing with the North Korean challenge. So it is very fortunate tonight that we are joined by a very distinguished South Korean, Han Sung-ju, who, as foreign minister of his country in 1993-94, dealt with the North Korean problem during that earlier challenging period when he served as the Republic of Korea's foreign minister. Those years also were a testing time in North-South relations and in U.S. policy toward the peninsula, not only because of the threat from the north, but also because Minister Han served as a senior official, as the foreign minister, during the first elected civilian government in South Korea, in 30 years, and thus was not necessarily entirely trusted by the South Korean military. As chief architect of the Republic's strategy for dealing with the North, Han Sung-ju brought a new tone to his country's diplomatic efforts. Always calm and insightful, Han Sung-ju urged both his own government and the United States, then the Clinton administration, to deal with North Korea more calmly and more rationally, and to cajole and tempt the North into diplomacy and away from the use of force. That is advice that might well be in order today. Always modest and quiet as well, Han Sung-ju let others take credit for the successes of that period and continually urged all parties that jaw is better than war, in Winston Churchill's famous words. Minister Han's patient and ultimately effective diplomacy paved the way for a mid-1990s agreement between the United States, South Korea, North Korea, and other parties, under which North Korea, for the first time, agreed to halt its nuclear program. This was the only period in the 70 years since the Korean War during which tensions on the peninsula were significantly lowered and dialogue ensued. So against this background, I am personally honored that Minister Han Sung-ju, my good friend, joins us in 2017 as the Marshall and Bouton Asia Fellow of the Chicago Council. I ask you all to please join with me in welcoming Han Sung-ju.
Thank you very much to the Chicago Council and to Marshall Bouton. I couldn't hear everything he said before coming in. I was spying a little bit to see if he was exaggerating or understating, or whether he was making any alternative truths, or he was indulged in some fake statements. I trust him enough that he didn't do that, but hope that he didn't any of the things that I mentioned, and then I'm sure I was given the kind of picture that I hoped I would be given, which is as I have been, and I continue to be in the future. I would like to thank the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for inviting me to give remarks today. It is a pleasure to be here as part of the Marshall Bouton lecture series. In a few days, President Bouton of the United States will be visiting Seoul, where he will meet President Moon Jae-in and speak at the Korean National Assembly. On both occasions, the main topic will be the threat of North Korean nuclear weapons. I know that even today, many of us are concerned about the threat of nuclear North Korea and rising tensions in the Korean Peninsula. So I would like to start with two questions that we have been hearing often today. Lately, are we at a nuclear tipping point with North Korea? And if so, what should be done? First, there's the issue of real North Korean capabilities. North Korea is indeed rapidly developing its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile technologies. On September 3rd, 2017, North Korea detonated its sixth and most powerful nuclear bomb. And in July, the regime tested what it claimed were two intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of reaching the continental United States. Always, Chicago comes up as the city that would be the first available target because it's not too far away, not too close, and just enough for North Korea to mention a city that everybody knows with all its good things and not so bad things, not so good things. Anyway, few people question anymore whether this is a true North Korean objective, rather than ask, can we stop them from reaching this nuclear threshold, and what will North Korea do when they actually reach this point? Then there's the second issue, which is the war of words and personalities between US President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Unfortunately, it has largely overshadowed the primary issue of North Korea's military capabilities. This game of verbal nuclear chicken, as some have called it, not only makes it more difficult for us to take the North Korean threat seriously, but it also seems to have turned a serious issue into a verbal game. I would argue that North Korea's rapid advancement in WMD capabilities makes it very likely that we will reach a tipping point with Pyongyang if we haven't already. What do I mean by tipping point? I mean the point at which it will be virtually impossible to roll back or even freeze North Korea's nuclear program, and the possibility of a military clash by accident or miscalculation will expand. There are some who believe that we have already reached the point of no return with North Korea, and therefore call for acknowledging North Korea as a nuclear weapons state. They think we should focus on managing the problem through deterrence and containment, much like the United States did in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Those who subscribe to this view advocate a limited form of engagement with the country. Others call for more drastic measures, like regime change or various military options. Those who believe in this view think that the only way to get rid of the North Korean threat is to eliminate the source, which is the Kim regime. Although this is not the first time that we have approached a dangerous point with North Korea, the danger today is higher than any other time. So whom and what is to blame for this dangerous and precarious situation. There's plenty of blame to go around for our failure to stop North Korea's nuclear weapons development over the years. The United States blames China for not doing enough to stop the North Korean nuclear program. Koreans blame the United States for not giving enough attention and weight to the seriousness of the North Korean nuclear weapons. When I was serving as ambassador in Washington during the early 2000s, President Bush, George W. Bush, used to have summit meetings with his counterpart from South Korea. Invariably, I don't know whether it's 3 times or 4 times, he would say, "I'm sorry, Mr. President." He's talking to the South Korean counterpart. We, the United States, is more concerned about Iran's nuclear weapons. I could think of a number of reasons why Iran at the moment is more important to the United States than North Korea, despite the fact that Iran was at the beginning stage of developing nuclear weapons, whereas North Korea has already embarked on nuclear weapons development and production. A little side translation of the conversation that went on was that, in fact, the South Korean president, who was Mr. Nomuhyun on the progressive, on the left side of the picture, was not very unhappy to hear that, because he thought the president is now focused on Iran rather than on North Korea, and therefore maybe the Korean peninsula would be saved from America's worst attention and worst treatment of a nuclear developing state. In any case, that is the state that the United States was paying more attention to an incipient Iran rather than North Korea, which already had developed a great deal, had gone a long way in nuclear development. The Korean right blames South Korea's 2 successive progressive governments, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, for giving financial assistance to spend on nuclear weapons development. The Korean left blames the United States, supported by South Korean conservative governments, for making North Korea feel militarily insecure to the point of feeling it needs to develop nuclear weapons. I had an occasion, President George H.W. Bush came to Korea after he served as president of the United States to have a quick look at the newly elected president of Korea, the progressive president Roh Moo-hyun, back in 2003. I had just been appointed to go to Washington as ambassador, so I was invited to a lunch that was given by the Korean president to the former senior president of the United States. He was in the United States. George W.H. Bush was in Korea to measure out what kind of a person this new progressive sort of fireball leftist president was like, and came to assure him that his son, George W. Bush, was actually quite a nice guy. You two will get along fine. So I'm happy that I've been able to be a good bridge between you two. President Roh Moo-hyun was saying in no uncertain terms that he was convinced that North Korea was having nuclear weapons because he felt insecure, because he felt that the United States was going to attack North Korea and conduct some kind of a regime change in North Korea. And therefore, if the US made North Korea feel secure, North Korea would surely give up its nuclear weapons. I was being quiet. I was not going to get into that kind of conversation. The translator of the conversation, Nomuyan, didn't speak any English, didn't understand much of what was going on, said that so much so was spoken by the Korean president. And then the translator, then President George W. Bush said, well, I don't know about that. And in my training of English language, when somebody says, I don't know about that, that usually means I don't think that that is the case. I don't agree with you, what you are saying. That's just a nice way of saying, I don't agree. And then the translator literally translated that, saying that he says he doesn't know much about that subject. It turned out to me, I got the impression that the Korean president at that time, who was quite new as president, not very experienced in talking to Americans, much less a former president of the United States who has gone through thicks and thins and has done a lot and expressed a very sensitive subject in a very careful way. But the president came out with the idea that he was able to educate this American former president with something that he hadn't known before. He was so naive to think that the North Koreans were simply trying to be gung-ho about their weapons and therefore going nuclear. So I told him that actually they are developing nuclear weapons because they feel insecure, which was his own conviction. He later, I'm sure, changed his conviction because he had to talk with me for many, many hours about North Korean nuclear weapons and why they were into having nuclear weapons. Anyway, that was the situation then. Let me just go on about the blame game a little bit. President Trump blames his predecessors for leaving a mess, quote, a mess, unquote, regarding the North Korean nuclear issue to him to fix. On his part, President Trump, with his blustering rhetoric and name-calling, is blamed for contributing to elevating tension on the Korean peninsula. The history shows that there are many reasons why we have gotten to this point, and it is true that both the United States and China paid insufficient attention to the seriousness of North Korean nuclear problem. China has been more concerned about keeping the North Korean regime afloat than stopping North Korea's nuclear program. The United States has been too preoccupied with and diverted to the Middle East and the Iranian nuclear issue. Only now, as the threat of North Korea's ICBMs to continental United States becomes more and more real and apparent, Washington seems to be giving the kind of weight and attention to the North Korean problem that it deserves and demands. China seems to be paying more attention to North Korean nuclear denuclearization, partly thanks to the chicken game President Trump is playing with Kim Jong-un. I guess some What brought us to this point? Just a brief historical review of the last 25 years show that the first North Korean nuclear crisis was precipitated in March 1993, when Pyongyang declared it was withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty And at that time, I had just assumed the post of South Korean foreign minister and was charged with the task of working with the United States to resolve the crisis. This was another point at which we faced a daunting set of choices: economic sanctions, military options, and diplomacy were all considered at the time, whether we can apply which option, when and how, and in what mixture. 19 months later, the United States and North Korea signed the Geneva Agreed Framework, which froze the North Korean nuclear program and reinstated an IAEA inspection regime. And it was in exchange for two 2,000 megawatt light water reactors, upon the completion of which North Korea promised to dismantle all of its nuclear facilities and program. 9 years later, in 2003, however, the agreed framework was discontinued as North Korea was found to have clandestinely started its highly enriched uranium program to build nuclear weapons. When the United States suspended its monthly supply of heavy fuel oil as stipulated by the agreed framework, North Korea restarted its nuclear program openly and actively. North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in 2006, and in 2012, after nearly 10 years of on-again, off-again negotiations, it became a self-declared nuclear weapon state and even inscribed this status in its constitution. Then what went wrong? What can we learn from the past as we deal with the present problem? Was the Geneva Agreed Framework of 1994 defective? True, North Korea cheated. We do not know if, when North Korea signed the 1994 Agreed Framework, it planned to have a clandestine nuclear program later on. Looking back, we can say that the agreement had both merits and demerits. Critics are quick to note that the agreement allowed at least 7 years to pass before the International Atomic Energy Agency could conduct the special inspection of the undeclared nuclear waste sites. What's more, the agreement rewarded North Korea with benefits such as energy supply and light water reactors. On the positive side, the agreement put an end to the crisis situation, which could have brought about a destructive military clash. It also succeeded in freezing the North Korean nuclear program and activities and enabled continued monitoring of North Korean nuclear activity or non-activity. In effect, it prevented North Korea from engaging in a plutonium-based nuclear weapons development program. Finally, it gave North Korea a stake in implementing the agreement. The prospect of receiving heavy oil and securing light water reactors would give Pyongyang an incentive to behave, at least for several years. Just last week, on October 21st, 2017, which was 23 years after the Geneva Agreement was signed, I and Bob Gallucci, who signed this agreement in Geneva 23 years ago, had dinner together. We opened a bottle of champagne and we said, "Job well done." And we were quite sure there are equal, if not a lot more, number of people who were saying, "All because of you." But we thought that Geneva Agreement was not a failure. It was a success, but it failed because of its success. I'll explain why shortly. So there are valid criticisms of the agreed framework as well as valid arguments of why the agreement was successful, at least in part. It is clear, however, that since resuming its nuclear activity in earnest in 2003, North Korea has made much progress in developing the weapon in numbers and capability. North Korea may have developed nuclear weapons anyway, regardless of what we had done or not done. Yet, in my view, we can learn something from the two past cases, 1992 and 2002, which inadvertently and perhaps ironically contributed to North Korea's march toward becoming a nuclear weapons state. One is the 1992 attempt to force a special inspection of North Korea after the IAEA discovery of a, quote, discrepancy, unquote, in Pyongyang's report. The discrepancy was between the amount of plutonium it admitted to have processed and the amount of the IAEA suspected North Korea had produced. The other was the 2002 attempt to probe the North Korean uranium enrichment program after the discovery by the United States that North Korea was engaged in that program. The first 1992 case, is where we placed more emphasis on probing the past activity rather than maintaining the current inspection regime of North Korean nuclear activities. The second case of 2006, is where we placed more emphasis on the future of North Korean nuclear activity than maintaining the present system of curtailing it. What I'm saying is that without ignoring or tolerating their past or potential future infringements, we could have handled the cases differently than we actually did. We are clearly facing or may soon face another turning point with North Korea. What should be done? And how do we use the lessons of history to help shape better outcomes? For the South Korean government, even as it is strongly opposed to North Korea's nuclear weapons, its primary concern is preventing the outbreak of military conflict on the Korean peninsula. Many of those on the left of the political spectrum assert that to avoid conflict, more security assurances should be given to North Korea by such means as concluding a U.S.-North Korea peace agreement. The current ROK government places emphasis on preventing the possibility of the U.S. carrying out a preemptive strike on North Korea. President Moon Jae-in is trying to deal with the North Korean nuclear issue by joining the United States in increasing pressure, meaning sanctions, on North Korea. But he also wants to be able to exercise veto on any military action that the United States might wish to take against North Korea. Even though he claims that he has such an assurance from the US president, in case an actual missile assault on the United States by North Korea takes place, South Koreans are not worried that the United States is likely to use force without the ROK president's consent. This is why the US president's rhetorical threats of attacking or destroying North Korea tend to raise South Korean fears of, quote, alliance entrapment, unquote. On the other hand, there are others in South Korea who would like to take stronger and more deliberate action against North Korea. 6 years ago, in 2011, Jonathan Polak of the Brookings Institution wrote a book called No Exit to describe the dead-end status of the North Korean nuclear program. Today in South Korea, a few additional ideas have been advanced to deal with the North Korean nuclear problem. Those on the conservative side argue that South Korea should arm itself with nuclear weapons because threats, sanctions, rewards, or persuasion will not work with North Korea, they say. If South Korea cannot develop its own indigenous nuclear program, they would like to see the reintroduction of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons withdrawn back in 1991. It is difficult to say exactly what the right combination of carrots and sticks or engagement and peaceful pressure policies will be to tackle this latest crisis. North Korea's 6 nuclear tests and long-range missile launches in recent months present both the need and opportunity for South Korea, together with the United States and other countries, to seek a different but more effective way of dealing with the North Korean nuclear threat. For now, it looks like the international community will continue applying increasing amounts of economic and diplomatic pressure on North Korea to encourage change and to build greater leverage for potential future negotiations. Pursuit of stronger sanctions should be part of a larger strategy to include North Korea to choose the path of change, one that allows it to join the international community rather than becoming further isolated from it. In this effort, a full-fledged cooperation from China is required. The problem is that China has construed its cooperation as a concession or favor to the United States and its allies. In fact, however, China should be working hard to denuclearize North Korea for the sake of its own interest, not as a favor to others. China should make all-out effort to denuclearize North Korea because, one, North Korea's nuclear weapons can pose a direct threat to all parts of China, which is one of the geographically closest neighbors of North Korea. Two, China can be seriously affected by nuclear accidents or war in the Korean peninsula. CNN, for example, recently reported that citizens of Yanji in northeast China felt fairly strong rumbling of the earth on September 3rd, the day of North Korea's 6th nuclear test. They are also very worried about possible radioactivity in the atmosphere, presumably resulting from the earth collapse of the recent North Korean nuclear testing at its site. 3, North Korea's nuclear arming not only strengthens the U.S.'s alliance relationship with its allies, such as Japan and the United States, but also brings its strategic assets closer to and around China, which China resents very much. And 4, North Korean nuclear weapons can bring about their further proliferation in East Asia. Henry Kissinger suggests in his column, Kissinger Imagines a Solution to North Korea, in Wall Street Journal, August 12, 2017, that rather than holding multilateral or U.S.-North Korean bilateral talks, the United States should engage in geostrategic talks with China, and China only, to find common grounds and methods that will make China persuade North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. I am not sure if China has the ability to do it, even if it agrees with the United States on the goals and methods. However, even if we do not depend entirely on a China-US understanding, such as the one Kissinger suggests, we should be openly exploring alternative ideas and proposals for dealing with the North Korean problem. Therefore, plans for dialogue with North Korea in any form must also be part of the larger strategy. Whether the format for the dialogue will be multilateral or bilateral remains to be seen. There is no guarantee that if talks resume, North Korea's nuclear program and activity would be curtailed. It, however, is certain that without the talks, North Korea will have an unfettered opportunity to proceed with its nuclear program. What does Kim Jong-un want out of his nuclear bombs and missiles? 10, 20 years ago, Kim Jong-il might have wanted nuclear weapons for the survival of his regime and to preserve his own existence. However, Kim Jong-un has made an extraordinary push to hasten the development of high-powered nuclear weapons, to miniaturize them, and produce ICBMs that will reach the continental United States. Why? Because Kim Jong-un wants to achieve more than his father or grandfather did. He wants to reach a position where North Korea can negotiate with the United States on an equal basis as a nuclear weapons power. He may also want to legitimize internal oppression and forced hardship of the people in the name of external threats and pressures. He also seeks military superiority over South Korea. We can think in terms of possible scenarios, several of them, that relate to this question. In the order of from most likely to the least likely, I would like to list the following scenarios for North Korea. The most likely scenario is one of North Korea muddling through. While continuing with provocations, North Korea will try to manage the situation so that it will not bring unto itself a massive attack, preemptive or preventive, or retaliation from the United States. Despite these international economic sanctions, North Korea may expect to survive it, partly by activation of the private sector economy, partly by flexibility in enforcing the sanctions shown by countries such as China and Russia, and partly incomes coming from illegal means such as cyber operation. Next comes the possibility of successful consolidation of power by Kim Jong-un and stabilization of the Korean situation. It may come as a result of some kind of a deal between North Korea and the United States, whereby North Korea would renounce its ICBM capabilities and the U.S. would acquiesce to the North Korean nuclear status quo. This is a scenario that South Koreans are quite concerned about at present. The third scenario is collapse of the current regime, or at least the exit of Kim Jong-un and its substitution by a new group, presumably through a coup d'etat, possibly consisting of military leaders. This will be equally belligerent, close to the outside world, and oppressive internally. The fourth is change of regime and/or policy in North Korea, accompanied by accommodation and reconciliation with South Korea. This may lead to greater inter-Korean cooperation and exchanges, although North Korea would be wary of possible erosion of its control of the people. The fifth possibility is a catastrophic conflict between the North and the South, supported by the United States. It will most probably end up with a victory by the United States and South Korea, but only after many casualties and much destruction on both sides. Although possible as a result of miscalculation or by accidental escalation, this is a rather unlikely scenario because none of the parties involved want this meaningless war to occur. In between the scenarios listed above, it is quite possible that a limited military clash, a clash that does not escalate into a full-scale war, may take place. There's another rather unlikely possibility of the collapse of the North Korean regime and unification of Korea by absorption of the North by the South. a regime collapse and change in North Korea, if and when it comes about, will be more likely the result of internal discontentment than external invasion. In the end, whatever scenario would materialize, nuclear weapons that threaten its neighbors and the United States will not help save the regime, as thousands of nuclear warheads could not protect the Soviet Empire in the last century. In fact, they are likely to weaken the regime by diversion of resources and inviting external sanctions. As we continue to seek a better solution to this intractable problem of North Korea's nuclear weapons development, I hope and expect that leaders and able security managers, particularly in the United States, can mend and cope with the current situation with steadiness and prudence instead of empty rhetoric. And I hope that we ourselves will hold them accountable for focusing with deliberate seriousness on the ultimate goal of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. This appears to be the only way to achieve lasting peace and prosperity in North Korea. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Han, for your remarks. To our live stream audience, just a reminder that you can ask questions by typing chi.cnf.io into your web browser. And we now have some time for questions from both the live stream audience and the in-room audience. If you have a question, please raise your arm. Once I've acknowledged you, a member of our staff will bring a microphone to you. The gentleman in the back, please.
What justification does the United States and the international community have for insisting that North Korea give up its nuclear weapons and impose sanctions? After all, the United States and other countries have been allowed to develop nuclear weapons, and it seems unfair to just arbitrarily cut it off at some point and say no one else is allowed to have these.
The nuclear powers and the non-nuclear powers made a deal in the name of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And there, 5 countries were allowed the status of being, officially allowed the status of being nuclear weapons powers. The rest were given certain other rights, but not to become nuclear weapons and to be very strict with the registration, reporting, and being monitored by the international body called the International Atomic Agency. And so it's not a question of you have the weapons, why can't the others have weapons? There was a strict regime agreed upon to make sure that irresponsible and unable managers of nuclear weapons holders will not be able to conduct nuclear war and threaten others with nuclear weapons, and at the same time to transfer this nuclear material and technology to other groups, such as terrorist groups, to rogue regimes, so that the citizens of the world will be more at ease.
In the second row, please, Mr. Porat.
Thank you for the history. I'd like to follow up on 2 of the alternatives that you mentioned. The third alternative was a change of regime. And how likely can that happen? It's very different from Germany, what happened, the situation. The 5th alternative was a conflict of some kind of arms conflict. And my question is, did anybody estimate how many casualties will there be in South Korea if a war starts between the two?
I think there's a science and there's a history. The science tells us that at some point, it doesn't look like a regime or a situation will change in any fundamental way. That was the case with regimes like that of Stalin. That was the case with Muammar Gaddafi. There was the case with Ceausescu, and so on. And at some point, they all give way, and they prove how brittle and fragile these supposedly very strong regimes are. And that is how science makes it look, and from a scientific point of view, very, very unlikely. But then history tells us numerous cases where what seemed to be so invulnerable, so unshakable, does shake, does break, sometimes just like an ice breaks with a sharp point of needle, breaks. And we've seen that. I've seen that in my own life with the government of Syngman Rhee. I've seen that with government of Chun Doo-hwan, and I was hoping to see that with the government of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un later. It hasn't happened with them yet, but if somebody gives me 200 years of life and $2 million of money, I will bet all of it to them losing to history in some form. So it's almost a blind faith, but when somebody like Billy Brandt visited Korea back in late 1980s, he was sure that Germany would go on like that for tens of years. And there was absolutely no indication to Billy Brandt, who was such a flamboyant man. He didn't see the unification of Germany, which would take place within 2 years. And so these things can take place. North Korea is a unique case, but still, it's a historical case nevertheless, and I think it can take place.
And we have time for one remaining question. Could we go to the gentleman in the white shirt, please?
Hi, Foreign Minister. Part-time, I teach at a university in North Korea, and a lot of the discussions that I have with my students, especially this past summer, is about international sanctions. And from their view, they argue that if the U.S. wants better relations, why are they kind of limiting all the supplies that are coming into the country, especially kind of looking into the future? Their argument is, wouldn't the U.S. want better relations, and so why are they stopping all these things and causing people to starve within, or just have limited supplies within the country? In your opinion, do you think it's better to even strengthen international sanctions and impose them going forward, or do you think it's wiser to kind of limit them and even decrease sanctions going forward?
Can somebody translate in plain English what this question is?
Do you think?
Try again.
Are you for or against strengthening international sanctions on North Korea going forward?
If that is the simple question, I'm in favor of strengthening sanctions on North Korea, which will help to mitigate the need to use military force. And even though so far sanctions don't seem to have a decisive effect, there are two reasons that it will have more effect from now on. One is that countries such as China and Russia are likely to be a little more positive in implementing the sanctions. Second, right now, North Korean economy has become a little more susceptible to external pressure, such as sanctions, and therefore we do know more about where North Korea gets money than before, so we'll be able to deal with it. So North Korea may have greater difficulty with greater sanctions, and it will try to find a face-saving way of dealing with that pressure, which is fine with us because we want North Korea to respond to the pressure of sanctions.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll hope that you'll join us to continue this conversation at a networking reception immediately following this program. Now, please join me in welcoming Marshal Bouton back to Chicago and thanking Minister Han for his remarks.